Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Decouple Podcast, where we explore the science and technologies that can decouple human well-being from its ecological impacts, and the politics that can make decoupling possible. Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by returning guest Edgardo Sepulveda, a regulatory economist who specializes in telecommunications policy with an interest in electricity and decarbonization. I just did a fabulous show with Edgardo. I think, depending on when we release this, it'll probably be about 3 or 4 episodes back. Highly recommend people check it out. It was a great history of the grid, essentially, and on how it has been regulated over the years, the implications for both putting capacity on the grid and for what is favored, I guess, by different regulatory frameworks, with the context of what do we need going forward with the idea of deep decarbonization and the need to add capacity to the grid, not necessarily because we need more electricity, although if we're electrifying everything, but right now we have enough generation on the grid in most places, but we need to add a whole bunch. And what regulatory framework makes that work? So go back, check out that episode. Today, I'm super excited. We're doing a follow-up on 2 issues: the social cost of carbon and this carbon abatement cost metric, which has really blown my mind recently. Let me get out of the way and just welcome you again to the show, Edgardo.
Thanks, Chris. Very pleased to be back, and thanks for inviting me back.
So again, these 2 topics I'm really excited about. I have to credit Robert Bryce's excellent Power Hungry podcast with bringing me Reiner Khur, who is one academic who has been looking at this metric of carbon abatement costs. I think he's one of many, but this metric just really stands out to me because, again, the whole purpose of what we're talking about with deep decarbonization and energy transition strategies is to get rid of CO2 and try and do that efficiently. And with the recent closing of Indian Point, this is particularly tragic because, based on Reiner's work, which is probably representative of New York, given he's looking specifically at Massachusetts, the cost that he's coming to for abatement of CO2 is about $800 for rooftop solar, $300 for wind and solar, utility scale, and $25 per ton for keeping existing pressurized water reactors open in the States. So with all that in mind, this is really why I was excited again to reach out to Edgardo. I think it's kind of funny. I have Sean Wagner, who's sort of my chief science advisor if I have a really nerdy engineering topic to handle. And now I've got this, I'll call you my chief economics advisor, Edgardo. So again, a really warm welcome back to the podcast. Let's hit it. Again, I'm going to let you lead this a little bit. I think you have a structure for how you wanted to tackle this. So let's dive in.
Sure. Okay. And then so there were 2 things. Anyway, I was very pleased to listen on Robert Bryce's episode with Reiner, and there were 2 things that Reiner kind of brought to listeners, and I wanted to kind of do a bit of deep dive with you on both of those issues. And there's 2 kind of related issues. One is, let's call it a kind of global metric, and then the other one's kind of electricity specific. So the global metric is the social cost of carbon, right? Sort of, it's people refer to it as the SCC, and then the other one is the abatement cost, right? So what abatement costs do is, whether it's for a different electricity generation technology, whether it's nuclear, wind or solar, it allows us to use a monetary metric to be able to compare how efficient they are, each of them compared to each other, in terms of reducing carbon emissions. So those are sort of comparative within technologies or within actually programs, right? So,
and this is not just generation. This is also for things like electric vehicles, clean fuels, carbon capture and storage.
For any kind of, that's right. for any kind of because we economists, we can measure everything and put in monetary terms, right? And so we don't stop at generation technology. So for example, cash for clunkers, weatherization,
Right.
basically, recycling, everything where you can put a value on, you
Yeah.
try to do it, and you kind of you're able to compare things that are that how efficient they are in terms of reducing, a ton of carbon. So
Yeah.
that's sort of the comparative perspective, and we'll get into that. But a lot of this is coming from the global perspective, which is the social cost of carbon, right? Which is this idea of what is the monetary cost down the road of us emitting a ton of carbon today,
Right.
right? And so this is again a very much economics driven concept. It was and it's obviously very it's kind of gaining in currency, so to speak, because it is important, and it is driving a lot of policy. For example, here in Canada, we have a carbon tax, sort of the fallback carbon tax, which is, among other things, uses the social cost of carbon as a metric against which to measure and to establish the carbon tax,
And
right?
that
And
that's
so,
so that's very interesting, because I mean, here we're talking essentially about, paying for the externalities of the use of carbon
right.
emitting sources of fossil fuels. And I guess that
Mm-hmm.
includes things like air pollution, but also, worsening extreme weather. I mean, there's the impacts of climate change are just so multifactorial. I often find it's dizzying. And I think that's why a lot of climate skeptics are successful in their messaging, because they can point to one or two things and say they're not such a big deal in isolation. But when we add it all together, but what strikes me is that these costs are kind of incremental. Like, the longer we take to address CO2 and reduce our emissions, the higher the cost
Yep.
gets.
Yep.
And so that is not a static number.
So yeah, so it's not dynamic. It's not static. And I just want to go through like 5 minutes, Chris, to explain how we calculate it.
Sure.
Right? I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty, and what it means and what it doesn't mean. Right?
Sure.
Because there's, it can be used and it can be abused. Right?
Okay.
And so it just, in terms of providing the listeners a bit of a looking under the hood, so to speak, is on that. So it's a relatively, the idea has been around for about 20, 30 years. It was popularized by a bunch of economists, the lead of which was Bill Nordhaus, who is
Right.
Ted's uncle.
Nobel Prize winner in economics.
Yeah. He won
issues.
2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And he came up with, and so ultimately there's a theory, but ultimately it has to be calculated using an Excel spreadsheet or more sophisticated software. And basically what you do is you have 3 or 4 components. One is you project into the future, 50 years, 100 years, 150 years, population, economic growth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then you have a different module which kind of looks at climate. Again, it's not a climate model. It takes input from actual climate models and
Sure.
kind of incorporates there. It then has what they call a benefit and a damage function, which is to say that it calculates into the future, starting from today, into the future, 2 scenarios, a baseline scenario, and then a scenario where you add a ton of carbon, and then it calculates the monetary costs for 150 years into the future, right? And then a 4th module, what it does is it brings that all back into today's dollars in a net present value perspective.
So, this raises a very interesting point, because a lot of climate complacence, I think a good example of that would be Bjorn Lomborg. and I think Michael Schellenberger, to a degree, would share some of these perspectives, is that, listen, yes, climate change is going to add more stresses, but the net benefit of lots of economic growth and, and continuing our emissions is going to outpace that. If we have enough tractors and fertilizer, we're going to grow more food. And so, yes, there's going to be a climate cost associated. It's not catastrophic, though. And because of ongoing development and economic growth, we'll be well suited to handle it. And I mean, I'm not endorsing that perspective, but I'm just sharing that as one that I think, I don't know how that fits into this social cost of carbon metric.
Well, it would probably look. I mean, you'd have to get into the numbers, but it probably, what it does is that it would probably, it would probably say that in the future, as a baseline, we would be able to mitigate some of those costs, right? Like those costs wouldn't actually occur. I think is one of their arguments. And that is a valid response, but it's still, you still have to actually mitigate those costs, right?
And there's a ton of uncertainty in the climate model.
And there's a ton of uncertainty because you're going 150 years, right? And then
you're done. 150 years, you're done.
Well, whatever. I think it goes into infinity.
There's like this kind of the climate and the modeling uncertainty is interesting, because on the climate skeptic side of it, they're saying, well, it's so uncertain, it could go any which way. And then on not, I wouldn't say on the alarmist, but I think of people like Mark Linus, his book 6 Degrees, check back, I think it's like episode 6. He's like, there is a non-trivial chance, that maybe 10% chance that there's a whole bunch of positive feedback mechanisms, and a 10% chance that we head to 5-6 degrees, which is catastrophic. I think there's consensus that it's catastrophic. There's not consensus that we're heading there, but there's a good non-trivial chance. Anyway.
And then all of these models, you run them hundreds or thousands of times, and there's a number of them. And what you get is like a distribution, right, of results. Right. And so the ones that you see are what they call the central distribution, right? So think of a normal distribution. So what you see, what people present, is the central run, basically, right? Gotcha. So that you get 1,000 runs, you have some kind of distribution, just like the IPCC does.
We'll stay within a couple standard deviations.
Yeah, exactly. And then they also, nowadays, what they're also giving you is the 95th percentile. Right. That is like, if really things go bad, this is the implied cost. So the difference between a central estimate, let's call it $50, $50 per ton, and a 95th percentile, you're at maybe $200 or $300.
Right.
That is to say that if you want to avoid this kind of 95th percentile catastrophic result, your carbon cost right now is $200 or $300 compared to the central estimate, which is closer to 50.
And this is often likened to like how much you pay on your insurance policy based upon the risk you're heading into. Is that kind of what like SEC is? It is an insurance policy, or it's just meant to disadvantage fossil so that we go more towards clean energy?
Well, that's right. It's basically a cost benefit analysis, right? Yeah. Of how much we're willing to pollute now versus how much it'll cost not only ourselves, but all the people who follow us, right?
Right.
And so there's 2 or 3 ways in which the social cost of capital of carbon, I said that, capital again, can vary. So one, again, you can vary the assumptions, right? Like how much economic growth you're going to have, how bad is the flooding going to be, et cetera, right? So that's one thing. The other way you can do it is you can change, and probably one of the biggest drivers in the results, you can change the discount factor.
Yes.
Right. So for example, if you value $1 lost due to flooding in 50 years versus $1 of today in terms of foregoing something because you're paying, that's, so there's a trade-off there, and it's the way in which to bring back to today's dollars. So for example, most of the discount factors are around 3% into the future, right? Yeah. But if you put it at 7%, and it's a beauty of compound costing, your carbon cost at $50 at 3%, if you'd use a 7% discount factor, you're probably down to $5 or $10.
And sorry, I really, unfortunately, I really don't get discount rates.
Okay.
So I'm gonna need you to make it for dummies. I'm sorry to my
So
audience.
it's
Who
all right.
probably
So it's like an
does,
interest rate. It's kind of like an interest rate. It's
so
like an interest rate.
and the idea is that it's like, what is shit, that like down the road the cost of not doing anything is more expensive, or it's better to have the dollar now.
It's better to have the dollar now.
So it's better to kind of not to pay it at a certain discount, like at a low discount rate, but at a higher discount. No.
Yeah. So a higher discount rate means that you value future people's dollars much less than you value your own.
Gotcha.
Right. So that's one of the ways. And so, for example, under the former president of the United States, he directed his working group to use a discount rate of 7%, right? Compared to what the previous president had used for 3%, and the current president is using 3%, right? And so that made a huge difference. And the other thing that he did, Chris, is that he said, look, you know, a ton of carbon that I emit in Cincinnati or Los Angeles is not only going to impact the United States, it's also impacting here in Toronto and in Delhi and in London and in Paris and in Sydney.
Yeah.
But what he said is, I only care about the United States.
Right.
America first. Yeah. So he calculated the cost only within the borders of the United States. So his social cost of carbon was, I think, $3.
Wow.
The previous president had calculated around $42.
Right.
And the current president is now calculating at around 51. So that's the way in which you can play with these games. And so having a social cost of carbon of 3% basically says, do what you want. You know, it's free.
I think this feeds in a little bit to I talk a fair amount about this on the podcast, this idea of carbon debt, and that industrialized countries, you know, they got a head start. They put tons of carbon into the air. They industrialized, you know, they were able to start taking care of their environment better as they got wealthier. And now it's these other countries, like these rising countries that are saying, hey, we have the right to emit. I think China at the Copenhagen Climate Conference, I forget the exact term they use, but basically, you know, we have the right to emit, to develop. You guys did it. We have the right now. And this concept that, okay, these developed countries have a moral duty to start, you know, leading the way on this because they've already sort of spent their budget.
Right.
And it kind of reminds me a little bit of, maybe I'm taking the analogy too far, but kind of reparations for slavery or something like that. You know, I don't know if it's a good match, but it's.
Yeah. And those, I mean, that's one of the other critiques. I mean, other than the technical critiques that I've gone through, and like the critiques associated how you treat climate damages, which is a huge kind of study area. One of the other critiques is this, which is about the distributional aspect. Right. So these, you know, so $1 lost to Jeff Bezos's grandchildren.
Right.
Is valued to the same as somebody in a low income country that, you know, whose, you know, rice paddy gets flooded, right? So obviously that's not from an equity and fairness perspective. Most of us would see that as that dollar should not be valued the same way, and we should have equity weighted social cost of carbon, and that is a thing that is happening right now. Equity basis, an equity base where you value who actually bears the cost of this. Exactly.
I mean, it sounds great. I like the idea. I'm a dreamer. I'm an idealist, but it's like that requires like a world government to enforce or something, right? Or like a UN that's got teeth, and it requires countries like the US to you know, sign on to treaties that disadvantage, like that are like America not first, right? So
yeah,
I like possibly the idea, but it's like the realism of it is, I mean,
no, agreed. Listen, it's just like it's a bunch of academics and professors, you know, crunching numbers and saying, look, what would happen if, right? What would happen if, and you know, and it, you know, in Canada, we're proposing now, the current government is proposing to move our carbon tax, as you know, from the current 40, where are we at 50 now? We're at 40, it'll go to 50, to what, 170 by by 2030, right?
Right.
So there's a bit of a rationale for all of that. And one of the rationales is that, should we be erring more on the side of like the 95th percentile, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So
what's really interesting about the Canadian example in particular, and I've got this is going to be my driver to source these documents, but I was speaking with someone who's in the know, and they were telling me that $50 cost of a ton of CO2 is not being applied to gas plants, because the government is trying to encourage the switchover from coal to natural gas in particularly in high emitting provinces like Alberta, Nova Scotia, which, I would rather they choose nuclear.
Right.
But gas is better than coal, I guess. But in Ontario, because Doug Ford refused to implement a carbon tax, the federal one is being imposed in Ontario. And those same incentives for the high emitting provinces are being attached to Ontario. And so as we shut down Pickering and lose a huge amount of our generation, I mean, this is a 6-unit plant, 3.2 gigawatts, the gas that replaces that is not going to have to pay the carbon tax. I think unless they're running at a really high capacity factor. I'm going to do a show on this, I swear. But so, I mean, there's so many loopholes and ways around this. It's very frustrating, and the hypocrisy is blatant in that example, where we'll be replacing a huge amount of nuclear capacity with gas, and that gas ain't paying the tax. And if it was, it would be a lot less economically attractive.
Yeah. And so just to bring back one of the ways in which policymakers are using the social cost of carbon is, for example, I think in the last show we chatted about the zero emission credits. So the way in which the zero emission credits are being calculated, which are about $17 or $18 US per megawatt hour for those nuclear plants, both in New York and in Illinois, is that they calculated based on the social cost of carbon, right? So a $40 or $50 social cost of carbon in those states translates to about a $17 or $18 zero emission credit. So that's one of the many ways in which, both in the United States and in Canada and elsewhere, this idea of the social cost of carbon is being used, to either do a cost benefit or to provide subsidies, or just in a way to be able to justify, rather than picking a number out of the air, to justify economic policy.
Right, and to level the playing field between different energy generation sources. I got to double check my numbers. Listeners, be skeptical of my mathematical ability, but from my understanding, Pickering displaces about 12 million tons of CO2 per year. Correct me if that sounds completely out of the ballpark, but that was, I think, something that I had calculated for me. So at $50 a ton, that cost would be, so if Pickering is replaced entirely by gas, and probably it'll be 80-90%, but let's just, for the sake of simplicity, 100%. So 12 million tons of CO2 at $50 will be $600 million a year that these utilities would have to pay in a carbon tax per year for the life of that gas plant, or it's wild, the implications that would have for the economic viability of nuclear, which actually is pretty decent here in Ontario.
And this is a nice segue, Chris, into abatement costs, because I think we've probably covered social cost of carbon.
Totally. And that number of $50, which sounds like where the Trudeau government is settling, where Obama was, where Biden is now. Again, using Reiner's data on New England, again, it was $800 for rooftop solar per ton. It was about $300 for utility wind and solar. Double that if it's battery backed up, interestingly. So $600. And then $25 per ton for nuclear. That's the only one that was below the social cost of carbon metric.
Right. And so just to get, again, I didn't get a chance to study Reiner's numbers, I do know our numbers, and I know other numbers.
And to be clear, like Reiner, this is a paper that's coming out. It will be completed, reviewed in a few months. That data, again, because I know that some critics of mine in Australia will be saying, hey, that's not accurate. it's going to be different. This is New England, right? Solar is going to perform better in Australia. You know, I still understand why we build solar so far north, but whatever. It'll be a lower cost. I'll concede that.
Yeah. So just again, going back to the basics, the concepts, I think it's important to understand that. So what you have is in any kind of abatement cost, you have a numerator and a denominator. Okay. Mm-hmm. So the numerator is basically the cost on an absolute term or on a megawatt hour of, you know, the type of generation or program that you're trying to measure. And on the denominator, it's the carbon intensity that you are replacing.
Gotcha.
Right. So it always has to be measured against the baseline. Right. And so
in Poland, for instance, I just had Adam Blazowski on. Their grid is insane. It's almost a kilo per kilowatt hour. So
that's exactly it.
That's exactly going to look really good for them. Even
that's right. That's exactly it. So it always depends.
So in Ontario, that gas replacement's even worse.
That's exactly it. That's exactly what it is.
Wow, because we're what, like 50 grams a kilowatt hour lower.
No, we're low. We're like I crunched the numbers out today. For example, they were at 22 grams per kilowatt hour. So that's 0.2. right, kilograms or metric tons per megawatt hour. So they're very, very low. So just to give you an estimate of, I crunched some of the numbers here. Let's look at the some countries and how clean or dirty the grids are. Just to give you a sense.
I particularly, I don't want to lose, but I want to talk about what adding like wind and solar or gas to Ontario versus or France, right? Because that's what they're in the process.
That's exactly it. Yeah, cool. That's exactly it. And just to get our numbers straight, we're going to use megawatt hours. Right, rather than kilo, because and that was easier to get it into the tons. So in the United States, across the whole United States, the grid's at about 0.4 tons per megawatt hour. 0.4.
Is there any way you can translate that into kilowatt hours for me? Because
that is 400 grams per. So let me use. You're right. Let me use the grams per kilowatt hours. So it's about 400 grams per kilowatt hour. Mm-hmm. Right. So like Poland is 720.
Right.
It's pretty dirty.
Cool.
In the EU, it's not the dirtiest though. Estonia is 890.
Holy shit.
Okay. Germany, just to give you a sense, is 338.
Yeah.
Sweden is 8. France is 50.
Holy shit.
All right. So that's the difference. Okay. Yeah. So regardless of if it's a numerator denominator, right? Mm-hmm. Regardless of if you take out the numerator and you just focus on where you're replacing it, your bang for the buck is going to be fundamentally different.
Right.
If you're going into Estonia versus if you're going into Sweden or France.
Yeah.
Because what are you gonna be displacing? It's always against something. It's not against the theoretical ideal. It's against what you're putting in.
Okay, right? And this is big, right? Because in New York, NRDC, Riverkeeper were saying, don't worry, Indian Point will shut down, but we will be replacing it with renewables. And they use the word offset. You know, the generation of Indian Point will be offset by that of new wind and solar.
Right.
Which is, replacing something that's, especially once a nuclear plant's been operating, every year the sort of life cycle CO2 gets smaller because you poured a lot of concrete. That's where a lot of your CO2 emissions are coming from. So that plant, if it runs 40 years versus 60 years versus 80 years, the CO2 per kilowatt hour, the life cycle emissions get lower and lower and lower.
Right. Exactly.
So shutting it down prematurely and then replacing it with something like wind and solar plus batteries in New York for, again, I'm using Reiner's numbers here, but assuming New England similar to New York, $300 per ton, maybe 600 with batteries added in.
Yeah.
It's Wild.
So that's and so, New York and whatever, all those states are about 400 grams per kilowatt hours. They could be, 450, 500. Anyway, they're in that ballpark.
Yeah.
They're representative of the United States. On the numerator, however, Chris, this is where it gets complicated, because there's 1,000 ways to fudge the numbers. And this is where you have to kind of have your quantitative antenna up to understand what is being measured. Because if you look at the IEA, right, the International Energy Agency, what they do is they use, something akin to the Lazar kind of levelized cost of electricity, where they say, look, grid solar can be done currently at $60 per megawatt hour, right? And wind can be like 30. And so that's a very big difference from the kinds of numbers that Reiner's has and some of the numbers that are coming out of Ontario, because
that's just the price to add it to the grid, though. That's not the price of abating a ton of CO2.
Correct.
Just so
correct.
Clear, right?
Because we're talking at the numerator now.
Yeah.
Right?
If you can try and use kilowatt hours, I'd appreciate it. I know some are better. Thank you.
I will try. And so, whether it's, they're coming out at like 20 or 30 cents per kilowatt hour, some are coming in very close to 15 or whatever. And so the difference being is that you have to read the fine print and understand whether or not these are actual results based on actual data versus theoretical results, or whether they are subsidized or unsubsidized.
And I think the big critique of Lazard's LCOE, levelized cost of electricity, is that it's just talking about adding capacity. It's not talking about the cost of intermittency,
right?
The
Correct.
cost of backup,
correct.
Which disadvantages firm dispatchable
Yep.
sources,
Yep.
and grid upgrades, etc. So it's purely the economics of the plant and what it adds.
Right. Exactly. And so, for example, I mean,
and the lifespan, I think Lazard is also bad on, like a 20-year, 25-year wind and solar versus an 80-year nuclear.
And you know what? Like we can discuss, the orders of magnitude between the costs of integration versus the intermittency versus the actual standalone costs. But those costs don't explain the huge differences of why you're getting your Australian solar friend to say, I don't believe those numbers, right? And the fundamental difference, and I don't know about what Reiner was using, but the numbers that I have for Ontario are consistent with that. And because we use the full price paid by the consumer rather than some theoretical price paid for, that's done, on the back of an Excel spreadsheet. So let me give you an example. I mean, this is I'm going to point to the listeners to a piece of paper that just came out by the Ontario Energy Board, which is the
regulator?
The regulator here in Ontario. And they came out with the current, just to give you an example, the actual cost of the different technologies in Ontario over the last 6 months has been as follows. And these are all in cents per kilowatt hour. Hydro, 6 cents. Nuclear, 9 cents. Gas, 13 cents. Wind, 15. Solar, 50.
50.
Right? 50.
Yeah.
So which is equivalent to $500 per megawatt hour, right? Yeah. And so you're thinking, how is it possible that there's a subsidized cost is so much higher than the theoretical LCOE by Lazard's? And it has to do with the specific subsidies that have been implemented not only in Canada but also in Germany and also in the United States through these production tax credits and investment tax credits and the renewable energy credits. So it's fundamentally important to understand when you're looking at the numerator, what cost is there? Is it a pure theoretical cost?
Right.
Is it a subsidized price? Is it something else? And
Yeah.
so that's how you can come up with, for example, if you come up with a price for solar of about 350, which is I think what Reiner came up with. Let's see, what did he come up with? Yeah, he came up with a price of about 350. So if you use that as your numerator and you apply and you divide it by the denominator of 0.4, which is sort of that number that we came up with.
This
you're
is
coming
Ontario's low carbon grid. Is that what you're saying?
No, this is in the New England, Reiner's piece, right?
Sure.
So Reiner's piece came up with 350 for the cost of behind the meter solar PV,
right?
On the actual production costs, and then you divide that by the 0.4 or the 400 grams per kilowatt hour in terms of what it is displacing. You're coming up with about $850 per ton of displaced coal. And so you can see how you can apply these numerators and denominators to come up with abatement costs and compare different technologies and how efficient they are in terms of displacing carbon.
Just to jump back to Ontario for a second, like you gave those list of costs, solar 50, and gas was 13. I'm just thinking, like, if gas had to pay $50 per ton, right, just for replacing Pickering, that's almost $500 million per year, or more than $500 million per year.
Oh yeah.
What would that do to the 13 cents per kilowatt hour if they had to pay $50 a freaking ton?
Right. So I'll have to get
20
back
cents,
to you on
like that'll be interesting to know.
Yeah. No, it would be, well, we figured out that in New York it is
and because that's particularly relevant because something like the refurbishment of Pickering, depending on how long you amortize it for, could add 2-3 cents, over 20 years or 15 years.
Yeah. Well, put it this way, if the $50 carbon social cost of carbon is equivalent to about $17 per megawatt hour in terms of the zero emission credit, that's like 17. Yeah, that's like 17. It's basically doubles the price.
So that takes natural gas from 13 to 26 cents.
Yeah, no, like it would go another round numbers to about 17. Yeah, it would go up to 30 cents. Yeah, that's it.
Natural gas would be 30 cents a kilowatt hour
versus
refurbing. Again, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but my friend Chris Adlam has crunched a lot of these numbers, making a variety of very conservative assessments. But I think amortized over 15 to 20 years, refurbing Pickering might add 3 cents. So take it from 9 cents to 12 cents, or get it to where natural gas is now. And natural gas, if it paid $50 each ton of CO2 it emitted, we'd be up to 30 cents a kilowatt hour.
That's what it would be like. Again, it probably wouldn't be. I'm not sure exactly how much it's emitting. I mean, usually those things are on average, but because I mean, we don't have coal anymore, and so which is very, very dirty, and so I think natural gas. But the other thing is that to do this properly and to have it kind of like be more credible is we're just kind of adding numbers, like we're using gross numbers here in the numerator, underlying numbers there. A really careful study would actually go on a market by market basis, Chris, and actually study what is displaced, right? So for example, many of these things are done on modeling, whereby you say, look, if we took off Indian Point, what is likely to happen, right? And ultimately we don't know. I mean, we can guess, right? But so another way to do it, that's a prospective study, like that's looking towards, how would it be replaced? Another way to do it is, retrospective, which is to understand
what happened to Vermont Yankee.
That's right. And so just literally 2 weeks ago, some researchers, profs at Queen's University here in Ontario, came up with that exact study for wind in Ontario.
Gotcha.
Right. What they did is they ran a bunch of regressions on a hourly basis to understand when wind was established in Ontario, what is it that they displaced? And the numbers are interesting. They were displaced about, for every megawatt that went onto the grid, they displaced about 55% of that was displacement of gas. About 25 or 30% was displacement of hydro. And then another 15%, as we know, was exported to the United States, right? Because we had a surplus, right? And so based on this, what they did is they crunched the numbers and they came up with that the abatement cost was $290 US, per megawatt hour, right? So, when I tweeted, that the numbers that Reiner was putting out were consistent with the subsidized numbers that I had seen.
Right.
Those are some of the studies that I was referring to.
And so you said $290 per megawatt hour or per ton of carbon abated? What are we?
Per ton, sorry, per ton of carbon abated. Yeah, there you go. I got my units mixed up.
But that's surprising because like if this is relative and the denominator is the grid that it's going on to, and Ontario is already so low carbon, you think that the number would be higher for Ontario versus Massachusetts.
Yeah, again, we're referring to a price, a numerator that it is at about 15 cents per kilowatt hour, and Reiner uses a larger number, right? So we're getting different references in the numerator, and in the denominator, we should be getting about the same number. But again, it didn't displace nuclear. It displaced, according to these academics, it displaced mostly gas.
50% gas, yeah.
About 55% gas, which would give you, in terms of displacement, something of displacing maybe 200 or 300 grams per kilowatt hour. Right.
I mean, so it's interesting because my understanding, in the early days of the Green Energy Act, the Germanification of Ontario, it's nuclear. Wind got first on the grid and did result in some nuclear shutdowns. So it was displacing nuclear
at that earlier stage. This study goes back.
Yeah. And then obviously nuclear takes 3 days to get going again. Wind would be backed by gas. I think we saved $200 million a year in gas, and our emissions, which had gone up with wind, came back down. But does this factor into account also like how out of sync wind production is with demand, or is that exports to the US that's accounted for there?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't take that into account. I mean, what you do have to,
because we curtail like 25% of wind output. It's producing, I think our spring and fall demand is something like 10 gigawatts. Nuclear is generally running around 9 or 10. We have hydro on top of that. So in the winter, like spring and fall, Ontario's emissions are kick ass, right? We're seeing it like teens in terms of grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And that's when wind is kicking ass and it's coming on the grid and we're like, yo, we don't really need you right now. Thanks for showing up. But curtail we'll give you to the US. This is a really funny. I had a great conversation with Paul Acchione, the former I'm not sure if he's the president of the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers, but he was saying like we basically pay a ransom to Ohio Valley to turn off their coal plants by sending our wind there for 1 cent a kilowatt hour, or even negative pricing sometimes, so that they don't, it does displace carbon to a degree because it shuts down some of their coal plants and all that pollution that comes up the Ohio Valley and pollutes Ontario. But I mean, this is getting very interesting in terms of yet Ontarians are bearing the cost of that.
That's exactly it. And so one of the things they do is they do calculate how much carbon is displaced based on that 15% of wind capacity that is actually exported. Right. So that gets taken into account.
Okay.
And so they calculated about 290, And just looking at the study here. Anyway, I'll put it up on the show notes, because I think it's interesting and it's very current. And it's also, like I said, it takes not the theoretical costs or the theoretical displacements. It actually does a careful study of looking at the actual costs, what it costs with embedded contracts, which is one of the big things in Ontario, and what it actually displaced in practice, rather than what it could displace, on average in principle. So it's those kinds of careful studies that kind of like are have greater credibility. There was a recent study about that was put out again on renewable portfolio standards that did that, the 29 states that have that. And they came up with estimates that also take into account those integration costs, for example. And they came up with, estimates of the abatement costs associated with the actual program of a renewable portfolio standard of between maybe 100 to 250 US dollars per ton. Okay. So these are kind of like, again, careful study looking at the actual costs fully integrated into the grid versus what it actually displaced. Mm-hmm. And there you can get some pretty accurate numbers.
So to shift gears ever so slightly, Bill Gates' recent book, How to Avoid a Climate Catastrophe, one of the central themes was this idea of a green dividend, right? Like, and to me, it kind of struck me as a little bit of a sort of consumer politics thing of like, well, if I pay this extra amount of money for a EV car, yes, it's costing that much more than a gas car. And so his whole thing was we need to get innovation, technology to drive down the difference between a gas car and a battery powered car, so that we can so it'll make consumer sense just to pay for what is the green option.
Right.
Is that related at all, or is the carbon abatement cost like mirrored by this so-called green dividend, or is it a more useful metric to talk and to value? Okay, let's pursue this and this policy because they have the cheapest cost to abate a ton of CO2, or I think they're very different concepts suited for different.
I mean, put it this way: the costs of EV rebates and rebates for weatherization and cash for clunkers, those costs have been estimated to be quite high, right? Like it's an expensive way to do it. Right. Now, there's two things to keep that in mind. One is that we've always been just talking about what the static costs, the static abatement costs. A more sophisticated analysis would look into dynamic costs. So that is to say that, one of the ways that you could justify spending more what would otherwise be expensive is that if you believe that if you get people driving EV cars, electric cars, that would produce, that would incent companies to build them. Therefore, they would become cheaper. And so a little bit of expensive investment now in terms of getting it going down the road would have, could potentially have large benefits because of the dynamic abatement cost versus the static abatement cost. And so a lot of people who are advocates of wind and solar say, listen, yes, I understand. So even if they accept the numbers, they say, well, fine, but look at what we've done. We've lowered the cost of production in such a way that it is now much, much cheaper. And that reduction in costs would not have been possible had not, for example, Germany done that, right? Right. And so, how valid is that? I don't know. And would people have done it even if even if those subsidies weren't there? Or more importantly, one of my kind of pet peeves, Chris, is if those subsidies were so unfair in terms of that it benefited people that were high income and the costs were disproportionately borne by low income people, so that these subsidies were basically inequality creating mechanisms.
Wealth transfer to the rich. And I mean, that's what drives me nuts. I think in the details that's escaped me, but under the Green Energy Act, there was, I think, a $5,000 rebate for buying something like a $60,000 Tesla. And you think about, I mean, just how unjust that is, because everybody else, the average Ontarian who cannot afford a $60,000 fucking car, maybe even more expensive, right? These Teslas are insane. You know, you think about the cost of abating a ton of carbon with a Tesla versus an electric bus, or even just like, for God's, and I think Václav Smil would say this, is like, for God's sakes, like, you're actually serious about this, like making it a fucking electric Lada, like just make a simple goddamn car, like strip it down, make it cheap, right? You know, I think that's interesting. But again, just that idea of like, again, this is why I think it's such an important metric, and why I really want to popularize it is like, well, this helps us maybe more than the green dividend. This helps us make choices. Like, does it make more sense to, and I think this is probably pretty intuitive, but to build electric buses versus fucking Teslas, right? Or I mean, I'm thinking like in things, because a lot of people within the traditional environmental movement are saying, okay, we need to focus on energy efficiency, insulating houses better windows, you know, and that sounds great. What does that compare to keeping a nuclear plant online in terms of the cost of CO2? You know,
well,
I'm not trying to be a fundamentalist, right? But I think like this metric allows us to make fair choices, rational choices, not emotional choices.
And you know, the answer to the efficiency is clear. I mean, study after study shows that the cost benefit of weatherization, right, which is basically providing tax incentives or subsidies for people to, you know, to in the United States or in Canada to, you know, install new furnaces, to do better insulation, etc. The actual studies show that the efficiencies achieved were orders of magnitude smaller than the engineering estimates that on which the programs were based and approved. And so the actual abatement costs exist. You know, there were efficiencies made, but at an extremely high cost. And so the weatherization.
Do you have any estimate for that?
Yeah, the weatherization estimates are in the $200 or $300, depending on which weatherization it is, right? So again, I'll put that up in the show notes, but these are very expensive ways to actually save a you know, a ton of carbon. And it goes to the point of that people are not really technology neutral. Everyone prefers their wind turbines or, you know, their solar panels,
or their nuclear,
or their nuclear,
I gotta check my biases sometimes.
Right, for the sake of those, rather than for what they actually achieve, right? And so when you actually look at the numbers and you show the numbers, you know, it is a tool to use, and it is a tool to compare, and you know, it is, and so you compare programs, you can compare technologies, and you can compare all of them to a social cost of carbon.
And I mean, I think this is just, again, so illustrative of what a climate crime it is, you know, committed by NRDC, by Riverkeeper, by Sierra Club, to force the premature closure of Indian Point. You know, this metric is what absolutely demonstrates their hypocrisy. You know, the idea of offsetting, and again, we've talked about these numerators and denominators, offsetting or replacing nuclear with new build wind and solar. That is a climate crime. I mean, I almost hesitate to say it because it sounds so counterintuitive to the zeitgeist of our moment. But I mean, and again, I mean, it's not even happening, for God's sakes, right? I mean, they shut down there's 2 reactors, which produce 2 times more output than all of the wind and solar of New York State. That, you know, one of them was shut down last year. But again, like, it's just crazy to think about. In one morning in New York State, as much clean energy came off the grid as the entire wind and solar fleet. And it's like, could you imagine someone going under the hammer and smashing every single wind panel and with a cutting torch and cutting down every single wind turbine, getting it done in one morning? Like, that is what happened when Indian Point went off the fucking grid. Like, it's, and I try not to be, you know, I as much as possible as a podcast host, I think it's more interesting for my listeners if I'm not partisan, if I'm, you know, trying to, you know, maintain some degree of neutrality on this moving train towards a climate train wreck. But it's there. anyway, that's my rant. But just on the efficiency side of things, I do think it's interesting. I always love it's great now being like 60 something episodes into the podcast, being able to reference, previous guests, or, all of the knowledge I've been able to accumulate. Václav Smil, again, Canadian guy, or at least living in Canada. One of the things he said in regards to energy efficiency, one of the things he laments, and I think he's someone who's probably thinking in this idea of the cost of a ton of, and just being so highly numerate, the abatement cost per ton of CO2, is that, in all of this rapid build out, like the cost of renovating existing buildings and making them energy efficient is so much higher than, for instance, he's like, if we'd had a building code that said you needed to use 2x6s and your insulation had to be 6 inches instead of 4 inches, the savings, the energy efficiency savings, are absolutely massive. Or if China has built, I forget what it is now, right? Like they're building a new New York City worth of like cement and buildings. I forget, it's something like they're going to build 50 by 2050 or something. Like every year they add a New York City. I'm probably wrong. I'm probably underestimating. And he's like, those are all being built with like single pane windows, like, and the sort of cost going forward of that is just enormous in terms of how much more energy those buildings require, particularly as climate change creates more extreme weather. We need more air conditioning, more heating. It's a shit show. We were aiming for 30 to 40 minutes. Edgardo, we seem to be completely incapable of sticking to a timeline. I love the energy. This is a lot of fun. Is there anything else, just in a couple minutes? Again, we're going to have more episodes together. I got a feeling the chemistry's great. We're vibing here. But anything else on this topic that you wanted to hit on?
No, I think one of the things that I think this is good. I think I do want to set aside a discussion on Ontario, because I have a little bit of a friendly bet that I want to put to our audience, and maybe I can leave it with you now, and then okay. So the bet is okay. So it's so.
First of all, what are you wagering? Because there was an interesting wager between Ted Nordhaus and Ken Caldera about whether we kind of reached peak CO2 emissions.
Oh, right. No, I don't.
It was a few $1,000s. It was a long bet, but yeah.
Right. No, I don't know.
Here,
yeah, no, I don't. It's a friendly bet that I wanted to run by you, because I think it's one of those things that are interesting. Is that it's not surprising that when we're paying 50 cents per kilowatt hour for solar, and 15 cents for wind, which are very, very high, that prices have gone very much higher in Ontario than, it's right now the highest cost province in Canada. Right. And one of the things that I've always studied is the design and size of subsidies. And Chris would know this, but many of our listeners will not, that about 5 years ago, the electricity sector in Ontario was such a political hot potato that everyone was tripping over, all our political candidates were tripping over each other to kind of like who could come up with the biggest subsidy. Now, when you think of subsidies, you think of developing countries, subsidizing the electricity for their capital city.
For their poor people, basically, so they don't have a revolution or yellow.
Exactly. Now, in Ontario, I happen to believe that Ontario is the one and only national or subnational jurisdiction in the world that is high income that subsidizes their electricity sector to the tune of $6 billion a year.
Wow. Okay.
So that is like almost 1% of GDP goes towards subsidization of the power sector directly on a budget line.
Yeah.
Right. So my little bet would be, world out there, do you know of any other jurisdiction that does this? Right. Because I think Ontario takes the cake. I think Ontario is the number one in
we're number one in subsidies.
We're number one in subsidies that are necessary politically because this Green Energy Act got us in such trouble. Like, that's what it is. It comes out to the idea that other high
the Germanification, again, for those who are not familiar with the legislation, the Green Energy Act. But again, essentially, think of Ontario, France of North America, 60% nuclear. We Germanified and spent I don't know if you have the numbers on the tens of billions that have been spent so far.
Oh, I don't know, but I know how much we're subsidizing it per year.
Okay.
Yeah, 6 billion a year.
Just to be fair, though, is that all going to wind and solar, or because with the global adjustment, some of that goes to nuclear, hydro?
No, it isn't. Yeah. It isn't. It's going to the whole thing. Yes. But it is. So the idea being is that, in Germany they're paying these costs. Right. And people complain
except for the industry, and the industry does not, right?
Yeah.
The ratepayer
so
does.
They pay for them, but the ratepayer does, and the ratepayer basically revolted here. Mm-hmm. And so the government, again, high income jurisdiction, 15 million people, right? Yeah. $60,000 GDP per capita. So high income, large. And we're seeing, government subsidies to reduce the consumer cost of electricity to the tune of $6 billion. It's the 5th largest budget item on the provincial budget. Chris, it is larger than long-term care.
Wow.
Long-term care is about $5.5 billion. Right. We're at $6 billion. So like many other jurisdictions in the world, we've had a very high mortality amongst long-term care residents in Ontario. Yeah. A real shame, a real embarrassment. Yeah. And we had to
called in the armed forces. Yeah, the Canadian Armed Forces came in to rescue our long-term care facilities. Which were largely privatized under like another deregulation.
That's exactly it. Anyway, I'll just say that it is larger now. So it's not as if there's a free lunch. It's like the government has decided to spend money on energy subsidies, electricity subsidies, like no other government has in industrialized country. And, it's not as if there's a dollar for dollar, right? Like there's not fungible. And so they're choosing from a priority perspective to do this. And it comes at the expense of education, health, and many of the other services that are provided.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a fun place to leave it. We're going to do follow-up. Edgardo, a huge pleasure having you back. Again, just as I was saying, my chief science advisor, Sean Wagner, it's amazing. I now have like a very solid economics advisor. If you too would like to be an advisor on a topic, I'm thinking like, Nick Turan, who's the legend of what is nuclear, certainly a kind of nuclear technology savant, be my advisor. Anyway, so just such a pleasure, Edgardo. Looking forward to this coming out and the reactions that it gets. I think both the social cost of carbon, particularly the carbon abatement costs as a metric to make what do we call it? Technology agnostic decisions about what is the cheapest way to zero.
Right. Exactly. In practice and in theory, right? Yeah. Like what's actually happened versus some of these like theoretical things like gets put up by Lazard,
levelized cost, or
yeah.
Cut. We're gonna finish here. Amazing. Excellent. Great having you on. We'll talk again soon, my friend.
Okay. Bye, Chris.
If you enjoyed the podcast, please make sure to subscribe, like, and review us on your podcast platform of choice. Until next time, guys.